Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest on the program today. It is my privilege and pleasure to introduce to the radio audience and to the audience on the World Wide Web, Dr. Ron Paul, presidential candidate and medical doctor, member of Congress for some 20 years, representing the great state of Texas. Dr. Paul, it's a delight to have you on the program today.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be with you.
Yes, your run for the presidency has stirred quite an interest around the country. On the internet, you seem to be well received. In the debates, you have been well received in spite of some of the negative attention by the mainstream media. Tell us a little bit about your desire and why you entered this race.
The main reason I entered it was because a lot of people wrote to me for a long period of time, a year or two or three, and saying that I should do it, and I was always very reluctant, believing or at least assuming that there weren't that many people really interested in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. But I finally was talked into it, and I have to say that I've been pleasantly surprised that not only are there a lot of people out there looking for this message of strict rule of law in the Constitution, but it's a message that the young people have received very well, and I think this is just great. It's sort of like a discovery for me that we don't have to be negative with our next generation, that they're very, very interested in this. Matter of fact, their minds are more open to some of these views than even those who have been listening to the propaganda, for years and years and have learned to live with big government, and they learn how to lobby Washington. So I'm just really excited about the reception for this message of limited government and emphasis on individual liberty and personal responsibility.
Well, there's no one that is promoting that message as you are. And for me and for others like me, I know it is a breath of fresh air. For the listeners who may not know of your background, would you just briefly summarize your background? You have a military background. You also were a medical doctor. Tell us a little bit about your background.
I am an OB-GYN doctor. I practice OB-GYN and delivered over 4,000 babies. I did that off and on, intermixed with politics over 30 years, delivered over 4,000 babies. And I entered politics in the 70s, mainly concern and interest out of the monetary policy and the gold standard and the size of government and many of the conservative economic issues. And then after 4 terms, I went back into my medical practice, but then ran again in 96 and was reelected to Congress. This time I became more interested in foreign policy because I thought the foreign policy was contributing significantly to great dangers to us, as well as financially it was putting a strain on us. So I'm on, not only financial services, but also on foreign policy committee too, the Foreign Affairs Committee.
And you were also in the United States Air Force.
I was in the Air Force in the 60s. Matter of fact, I was drafted during the Cuban crisis, and it interfered a bit with my medical training, but it turned out to be good experience. I actually stayed in longer than I thought longer than I had to. I was required to stay 2, and along with my Air National Guard service, I was in a total of 5 years. So it was a worthwhile experience, but it was also educational in the sense that I did not have to go to Vietnam, but I certainly lived through the Vietnam War era, both in a financial sense and as well as getting experience in the military.
Right. Now, your stand for the Constitution is well known. In fact, it's probably the single ingredient that sets you apart from the rest of the pack. Explain, why is it so important that any office holder, whether he's the President of the United States or the county commissioner, congressman, senator, why is it so important that they uphold the Constitution?
The reason I believe it's important is that the best societies are those societies that are based on some type of a formal agreement between the people and the government. I believe the Constitution was the best ever written. I do not believe it was perfect at the beginning, and it's not perfect now, but it was the best and still is the best if we would follow it. But there are 2 issues there. Not only do we want a good agreement between the people and the government, we also want respect for following it. And to me, both are very, very important. Let's say that we find the Constitution imperfect, but you ignore it in certain areas, then we don't follow the rule of law. And that's what we have done for the last 100 years. We just ignore it. We don't follow it. So even the good parts of our Constitution has no value because we haven't stood behind it. Where there are problems in the Constitution, the founders allowed us to change it. It was to be done slowly and deliberately through amendments. But instead, we have now accepted the idea that the Constitution is not that important anymore. And the courts flaunt it. The executive branch flaunts it, as well as the legislative branch. They just totally ignore it, and I think this is the reason why we have a government doing all these things, which technically does not fit the bill that is written in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 tells us specifically for the Congress exactly what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do.
Well, iterate for the audience some of the problems that we are experiencing today because our elected officials are not responding to their duty to the Constitution.
Well, the one really big one is in foreign policy, and that is that we were instructed never to go to war without a declaration, and only Congress could do it. Since World War II, we've never declared a war, and since then we haven't won a war. So I would think that is a very, very important area. The money issue is an important one. The founders knew about runaway inflation with the destruction of the continental dollar. So they said explicitly, do not emit bills of credit, which is paper money, and that only gold and silver could be legal tender. And they had various reasons for that, and yet now we have a central bank, which is not written in the Constitution. The central bank provides the funding indirectly, for our government to do the things they shouldn't do. So if they're policing the world and running an empire, and they don't have the money and they can't tax us, they just print the money. Or if they get into the entitlement business, there's no provision in the Constitution that we should have a socialistic welfare state, and yet we do, and it's financed through the mere printing of money, which is very, very destructive, and the burden of the inflation falls on the middle class and the poor, and they're suffering greatly today, a lot more than a lot of people want to admit. And I think that it's so important that we follow the rules. If we want to change them, that we do. Fortunately for me, I want to defend the Constitution, but for many of us, we're delighted that the Constitution defends liberty. It is a document written to restrain the government and not restrain the people.
Right.
And of course, I think that's why our country has been so great and prosperous, is because of the way it was written.
Yeah, amen to that. You mentioned the declaration of war. Obviously, you were one of the few members of Congress who opposed the invasion of Iraq from the very beginning. This is an issue that with you goes back from the very beginning of this conflict. Explain your position. Why did you oppose the war in Iraq?
The number one reason was I did not believe that in any way was Iraq a threat to our national security. They had no army of significance, no Navy, no Air Force. They had no weapons. Even though we were told they did, they never convinced me of it. They were incapable of shooting down one single American airplane that had been flying over their country and bombing them for 10 years. There was no way that they were a threat to us. So that was the number one reason. The number two reason is that when we, as a Congress, passed a bill that gave the president the authority to wage war, even though it was not a declaration of war, they said that he needed to do this to enforce UN resolutions. And I think that is just an atrocious reason to send men off to war for this country to enforce UN resolutions. It should only be done for national security reasons, not to enforce UN resolutions. And this is, the main reason why I so strongly oppose this.
Plus, there was no connection between Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and the attacks on our country on 9/11.
That's absolutely correct. Matter of fact, 15 out of the 19 came from Saudi Arabia. Nobody was proposing that we bomb Saudi Arabia or attack Saudi Arabia because they were our financial allies. That was involved in oil and different things. But you're absolutely right. There was no Al-Qaeda there, and yet today we have Al-Qaeda and we have chaos, and we've lost so many men and so many severely injured. So it turned out very badly, and that, of course, is the reason why I've taken the position that we went in under false pretense. It's not going well, and it's costing too much in terms of life and limb, and I think we should come home.
Now, when we talk about being opposed to the war in Iraq, I'm sure you face the same criticism I do. They will often say that, we are not willing to fight terrorists, and we're not being practical. There are people in the world that do intend to harm us. We have the people that participated in the attacks on 9/11, for example, and so you don't want to protect America. Now, obviously, you and I don't believe that, but explain to the audience your position. You did support the retaliation against Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. Explain the difference to the people, because sometimes they're confused on this issue.
Yes, I voted for the authority to go after bin Laden, even the funding for that. The disappointment is that we dropped the ball there. We allowed them to get away. We deferred to the Northern Alliance and the Pakistanis to do it. Bin Laden is still up in the mountains, and yet we went into nation building in Afghanistan as well as in Iraq, which was a distraction. But it also reflects the overall policy that I talk about, because I don't like the technical things that have gone on with Iraq and Afghanistan. But the overall policy means that we always seem to be involved, and we're always on both sides of the issue, because in the 80s we were an ally of bin Laden because they thought he would serve our interests. Now he's our enemy. We were an ally with Saddam Hussein. We asked him, in a way, be our proxy for invading Iran. So, and then he becomes our arch enemy. And this so often happens with this interventionist policy that we're on and off again and never serves our interests. And I think we should have one purpose, and that is to protect America, to do whatever's in our national security interest, and take the advice of the Founding Fathers. Don't get involved in these entangling alliances and getting involved in the internal affairs of other nations. But even if the attack comes from our foreign policy that is ill-advised, we still can't ignore it. So that's the reason you still have to go after al-Qaeda. Some people would like to say, oh, yeah, he blames our foreign policy, so therefore he won't go after al-Qaeda. No, that is not the case. But I did add one other thing. Besides going after bin Laden, I reintroduced the notion that the early presidents used, and that was the letter of marque and reprisal. Mm-hmm. To, instead of declaring war against a country that wasn't responsible in a precise manner, that the letter of marque and reprisal allows a way of targeting an individual or individuals who are stateless, who don't belong to a particular country. And they used this when they went after the Barbary Pirates. Sure. In the early years.
Exactly. And I put that in the column that I wrote on your behalf back on August 28. Right. And I thought that was a brilliant strategy. And I'm really chagrined at how few congressmen and reporters and people that have the ear of the American people have seemed to understand and pick up on that. I think that's a brilliant move on your part, and I just wish that more would understand it.
You'd think they would have at least discussed it, but a lot of them, they'll say, what is that? I've never heard of
that.
Right. And that might be, a reflection of the journalists being lazy instead of looking it up. I went back and refreshed my memory on it. I didn't know every single detail about it, but I knew there was something that they did along those lines. Right. But because we didn't declare war against Libya or anything like that, we went after the pirates. Right. Now we should go after al-Qaeda. But we also have to understand what their true motivation is and why they would be willing to sacrifice their lives to come over here and bomb us, and I think that is so important as well.
Now, you authored in 2005 the Sanctity of Life bill. Unfortunately, it did not become law. A lot of people in the Republican Party talk about being pro-life, but then when it comes right down to doing something about it, not a whole lot gets done. But you actually proposed that human life bill, the Sanctity of Life. Would you explain a little bit about that bill and what it would have done had it passed?
Well, the first thing it does, it defines life as beginning at conception. Right. And the second thing it does, it takes the issue out of the jurisdiction of the federal courts. And we can do that with a majority vote, which means that it's so much easier than amending the Constitution. And like you say, let's say you even thought the Constitution should be amended, you could do this in the meantime. But I think there is a bit of hypocrisy there. They play to the audience and say, oh, yeah, we're right to life. But they won't come up with a solution like this, which you could do with Congress passing the bill and the President signing the bill, and every state then could do what they wanted. They could ban abortion. You would, in essence, repeal Roe versus Wade.
Exactly.
You don't have to sacrifice the principle of the states' rights and the principles of federalism, and yet you could solve the problem, and it would be done. I think it's an ingenious way that the founders provided us, with this method where you wouldn't have to amend the Constitution. If the federal courts are out of line, just take it away from them. I think it's a wonderful thing that they did, and yet we only rarely use it. It's been used, so there's a precedent for using it, but like you suggest, why haven't our leaders accepted this who claim they're pro-life?
Yeah, I personally think that because they really don't want to deal with the issue, they just want to use it to dupe the conservative Christian voters into returning them to office without having the responsibility of actually doing anything about the issue.
Right.
That's my personal opinion. Yeah. But it's a fact that it's part of the check and balance that our Constitution has provided, because we're not a monarchy. This is not a kingdom here in the United States. This is a constitutional republic, and the whole purpose of the three equal branches of government was to provide the check and balance so that there's one branch doesn't become dictatorial. But then again, like you said, it takes the resolve of the Congress to do it, and so far they haven't done that. But I salute you, sir, for being willing to introduce that bill, and I wish that your Republican colleagues would have come on board with it. And I wish the president would have come out and supported it, frankly.
Thank you.
Now, homosexual marriage. Let's talk about that just for a minute, because like with Roe v. Wade, which was abysmal law, and one of the things we want to do is overturn Roe v. Wade and take it back to the states, which was the way it was before 1973. Now, homosexual marriage, this is a hot issue all over the country. You have all kinds of debate going on about this issue. Where does Ron Paul stand on the issue of homosexual marriage?
Well, I think the term is an oxymoron. How can you, I often wondered why this debate even goes on. I think we give the opposition too much credibility because it's sort of like taking a word out of the dictionary and they want to redefine the word. How many times over 6,000 years of recorded history have they claimed that marriage wasn't a marriage between a man and a woman?
Yeah.
I think it's probably in the last, maybe this is a reflection of our culture or something, or the moral standards that we have. So I think that, the whole thing is a mess. I'm a strong supporter of the Defense of Marriage Act, which was passed in 96, I think, and I was not there to vote on it, but I would have voted for it, and I strongly support that. So for federal reasons, for federal law, the federal government has an obligation. But when it comes to dealing with problems like this, I have high regard for the Constitution. And when it comes to other things of this sort, the states, I defer to the states, such as a license for practicing medicine and all. But immediately, many of our friends then would say, well, that means that if Massachusetts does something, it's going to be forced on you in Texas or in Florida, and you're going to have to accept that as marriage. Right. And that is not the case. You don't have to. The only reason it is once again, the federal courts might force it on you. So I deal with this like I dealt, with the sanctity of life issue. I say that if Massachusetts does something and we think it's dumb, we don't want it imposed on us, so we will pass a law that says we will not accept, that definition of marriage. We don't accept medical licenses. Why would we have to accept, this definition?
Right.
We could do that once again by just denying it to the federal courts. And each individual state could do what they think is important at the same time. Use the Defense of Marriage Act to protect all federal laws and have the definition very clear.
Right. And exactly what does the Defense of Marriage Act state? What would it do?
Well, I think essentially what it does is it says that marriage is between a man and woman when it comes to things like Social Security and other events. Actually, they describe this as a social and a moral issue, but I'll bet you any money it's more economics than anything else. That people who call themselves married and we don't accept it, they're looking for benefits.
Right.
And, I think they want to impose their will on others. They want to say to an insurance company, well, yeah, we're not married, but we are, and we want to demand that the insurance company insure us equally. But, in a free society, the insurance company is supposed to decide that. If they don't want to accept that definition of marriage, they shouldn't have to. That shouldn't even be in the realm of government. But I think it's more of an economic issue rather than this civil rights issue and a social moral issue. That's my suspicion.
Right. Well, I think that that's certainly part of it. There's no question that there are some within the militant homosexual community that have an agenda to perhaps break down the morals of America. I think there is an element of that, but there's no question too that if you can use the law to get taxpayer dollars out of their pocket and into yours, they wouldn't be the first group of people to try that. Ron Paul and taxes and the Internal Revenue Service. I know this is another one of the issues that I think separates you from the rest of the pack. Explain your position on taxes and the IRS and that whole issue.
Of course, I'm very emphatic on this issue because I think the income tax is one of the worst taxes that you can have. I think it has led to a great deal of harm. And of course, that was established in 1913 with the 16th Amendment. I'd repeal the 16th Amendment. I would abolish the income tax, and I don't want to replace it with anything. Some people say, well, would you give us a fair tax? Well, there's some shortcomings with the fair tax, and I'm not interested in trying to replace it. I want to cut the spending. So true reform means you radically cut spending and you get rid of the income tax. The country is going to be much, much wealthier. I think there'll be a lot more prosperity. I think there'll be a lot less poor people. So I argue it from a humanitarian viewpoint as well as a freedom viewpoint and a constitutional viewpoint that we don't need the income tax. The income tax is based on the notion that the government owns us and that they own all our income and they permit us to keep a certain percentage. Even if the income tax is 1%, the principle is established that the government will tell you what you're permitted to have, and it should be the other way around. In a free society, you work, you have a right to your life and your liberty, you have an obligation to take care of yourself, and you ought to have a right to keep what you earn. And then it would work. The society would work. But this idea that we assume or concede to the government that they own us and our income, I think is a very, very dangerous trend.
Yes, amen. Now, one of the hot issues, I think, in this election is going to be the amnesty issue. We saw the Senate was on when they were poised, literally, to pass amnesty for illegal aliens. But an outcry, a literal outcry from the American people, maybe unprecedented in recent memory, caused the senators to rethink their positions on that issue. And, of course, it ultimately failed. Amnesty for illegal aliens, protecting our borders. Where does Ron Paul stand on these issues?
Well, I'm positively opposed to the amnesty, but what you cite there I think is very interesting. That as discouraging as it is some days when the people seem to be apathetic and Congress doesn't do much to help us, when the people finally get round up, we still have enough freedom left in this country to get the attention of the politicians, and they do respond. So that was very, very positive.
Right.
And that's what we have to do when we get annoyed enough with real ID cards and the Patriot Act and these different things. But I'm opposed to the amnesty. Matter of fact, I've taken a position where I'm opposed to this birthright citizenship. I don't think the 14th Amendment was ever meant that all you had to do was step across the border, have a baby in one of our hospitals for free,
right,
and then immediately become a citizen eligible for welfare benefits. So
Amen.
I don't like that. I also am convinced that we can't ultimately solve our problems as long as we have a welfare state. The runaway welfare state encourages a weak economy, and then when illegal aliens come over here and they get free medical care and free housing and free food stamps and free education, this very much annoys the middle class and the poor who have to pay some bills and pay their taxes, and they see these individuals getting in front of the line, especially in emergency rooms. This is very annoying. So I think the welfare state contributes to the financial problems and also the animosity. I'm so optimistic that I believe if we had a free market and sound money, we would have so much prosperity that we would be welcoming, immigrants. And I'd want to keep them all, legal.
Sure.
But I think there would be a need for and a welcoming that put out. But today, with a weakening economy and a system which literally encourages our people not to work, we create problems for ourselves.
Right.
But in the meantime, we need more border guards. We need more money that we could spend, and the only way we can do that is change our foreign policy, bring those troops home, put them on as border guards in our country. We have border guards over in Iraq,
Right,
off our borders. So that doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
So there's a lot we could do, but ultimately it's not going to be solved until we do something with the welfare state.
Yeah, it's amazing to me that we'll send Border Patrol agents to protect the border of Iraq and we won't even protect our own border. That's just crazy.
Yeah, I suspect, and I bet you others have as well, that there's not a strong desire to protect our borders because I see a lack of an enthusiasm for national sovereignty and a move toward a North American Union.
Yes.
And I think that's very real. People claim that if you talk like that, you're some conspiracy nut. But I think it's very, very real, and
I do too.
We shouldn't ignore it.
I do too. I'm with you, and I think again this is what separates you from the pack. And we only have about 3-4 minutes left here in this interview, but let's talk about that. You're opposed to the Patriot Act, and when so many of the others are for it, you were opposed to the Military Commissions Act. You're opposed to the North American Union and SPP. Spend a couple minutes telling us about that.
Well, this has been going on specifically since 2005. That's when I became aware of it, when the President Bush met with President of Canada and Mexico over in Waco, and they set up the SPP and the Security and Prosperity Partnership, which was an outgrowth of NAFTA. So it's just another level of government which actually neutralizes or eliminates national sovereignty. And now they've just met just recently again, and there's highways planned. If it's all imaginary, it's interesting to note that the House and the Senate in Texas voted unanimously to put a moratorium on the Trans-Texas Corridor because of their concern for the millions and millions of acres that will be taken under eminent domain and allowing, the transportation all the way from Mexico to Canada. So this is something very real, and for people to say that it's imaginary, but the truth is there's a lot of people in Congress, I bet if you polled the members of Congress, that either don't know about it or they're going to say that we're overreacting.
Well, when it comes to our national sovereignty, I don't think there is any such thing as overreacting.
No, and I think it's important that we have national sovereignty. I think we should not permit illegal aliens, but that doesn't mean that we should be hostile to immigrants or trade and travel. That was the advice of the founders. Don't get involved militarily, but I don't think they advise isolationism either. I think they strongly urge us to have foreign commerce. Matter of fact, they put the responsibility on the Congress and not on the executive branch. That's one of the reasons why I've always opposed fast track and these treaties,
right? Because
they're international in scope and they also give too much responsibility to the executive branch.
One other thing I appreciate about you as a member of Congress, Ron, is your stellar record on gun control. You consistently have maybe the best record in Congress. I can't think of anybody that's any better. Rating by the Gun Owners of America, for example, on gun control. I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for that, and maybe just a quick word as to why you believe it's so important that we protect that Second Amendment.
Well, the real reason the Second Amendment was written to make sure that people were armed in case we got an over-abusive government. A lot of people think it was for hunting, but it really wasn't. But the gun issue is the way we're supposed to be made safe. We can't have enough policemen to make ourselves safe in our homes. So there's every reason and a right for us to do so, and I think a moral obligation to defend our families. Instead of depending on the government, I think owners of all kinds of businesses are responsible. I fault the lack of respect for the Second Amendment as partial cause for 9/11. The airlines had assumed their responsibility, they might have had and felt needed to have some guns in these cockpits, and maybe the terrorists would never have even attacked us. But by federal law, we weren't even allowed to have guns in the cockpit, and we were told not to resist. So the federal government created some of the conditions that made it more inviting for terrorists to attack us. But the Second Amendment can go a long way to protecting us, and ultimately it tends to make me feel comfortable that as bad as things are right now, there's still a lot of Americans have strong beliefs in the Second Amendment. There are a lot of guns there, and hopefully they will always be used wisely.
And that argument you just made, I could have applied over at Virginia Tech as well in the situation with the shooting there.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Paul, it's a delight to have you with us today, and I want to thank you very much for spending this time with us, and encourage you to stay on in the fight, and keep getting that Constitution message out there. And a lot of folks here are praying for you, and I know that you're making friends everywhere you go. Are you going to be able to continue in the debates, and what does it look like in the primaries coming up?
Well, yeah, so far it looks like I'll be able to continue, and we have the on the 5th of September, there will be one in New Hampshire. Then I think there's one in Florida, on the social and moral issues. I don't know exactly what city that's in. I think it's in October. So far they're coming along. There were a few who tried to exclude me, but so far that hasn't worked.
Well, you hang in there, and we really appreciate you and praying for you. I'm a part of a meetup group that prays for you each week, and there's a lot of people around the country that are praying for you, and we appreciate your record in Congress and what you're trying to do for this country, and Godspeed in all you do, sir.
Thank you very much, Chuck. Nice to be with you today.
Thank you.